Yes, Matthew.
Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. Thanks a lot for the briefing. I wanted to ask about something a specific. I mean, I understand that your report is thematic, but there seems to be in Saudi Arabia there's a trend of migrant workers. There have been a number from Sri Lanka, but from others being executed, and you have countries. What would you? I mean, then there's also other executions of people who committed crimes underage and a variety of ones. But how does this compare, I guess, either to what other countries are doing, or what would you say about this process? Should the countries establish a legal office in Saudi Arabia to defend people? And I also wanted to ask, relatedly, on Sri Lanka. I know that in a previous briefing by you here, you spoke about the crimes that occurred at the end of the war in 2009. And now there's basically, it seems like the UN system, including the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, seems pretty convinced by the mostly domestic, somewhat international process. And I just wonder, as an expert in these executions, do you feel that including the execution of surrendering prisoners, do you feel that it's being sufficiently addressed, or what can you say about it? Thanks.
Yes, please.
So as you know, this particular report and the reports we do to the Human Rights Council, that's one aspect of our work, thematic reports as you've called it. But in addition to that, we have communications, letters, confidential procedures initially. For the first typically 3 months or so, it's confidential. But the very case that you've mentioned, Sri Lanka and Saudi Arabia, for example, is one of those cases where I did write such a letter. There was perhaps a good case, a domestic worker who was executed from Sri Lanka was executed in Saudi Arabia. And those kinds of cases we follow up on, not all of them, of course, because it's a worldwide mandate, but that particular case I did follow up on. So you ask whether the government should establish an office there. Of course, the starting point of this, what this report is about, is that governments already have offices. They have their consulates in other countries, and that is the link that they have to know what is going on there. In addition to that, some states in the Philippines and Mexico, as I've mentioned, then have a program to assist. Because in some cases, the problem is, of course, that states say, well, you've left our country, you're in a different country now, that was your own choice, and now you must fend for yourselves. But I think that if one looks at the consistent application of the right to life, that is problematic because they are really the ones in the best position to play that role. And I do think they have a duty of protection concerning their own citizens that other states won't have. So they already have an office there. It's of course something which doesn't work in practice in many cases. So I've mentioned some cases where it actually works quite well, but the infrastructure, so to speak, is there. It's a question of activating that. Your question about Sri Lanka, yes, and we had, as you know, the mandate was quite involved in the verification of some of the initial footage on Sri Lanka. I must say for myself, the whole development concerning Sri Lanka, this was in 2011 that I started that in my first report, and my predecessor was also quite involved in that. And as you know, that particular issue went up and down. Initially welcomed Sri Lanka's actions as acts against terrorism, and then eventually turning the other way around. It in a way reinforces my belief in that the system can sometimes work, and I think this outcome now, although it seems to be quite controversial within Sri Lanka, I think is a good example, perhaps the best one can hope for under the circumstances. So this tribunal that is called for, with I think in particular Commonwealth judges in a hybrid fashion, I think it is certainly something to be welcomed. And I do think it is important to see how it will be received on the domestic level now. But I certainly welcome the direction that this is taken. In many other states, many other situations, we don't have such an outcome. This is one of the cases where the system seems to work so far.
One really last question, Matthew.
Really short. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask you about this with the issue that's called killer robots. And I wanted to ask a very specific question. I've seen that you've said, so I'll just get to the question. The question is this: is it your understanding that in talks about banning or a moratorium on killer robots, that the U.S. and U.K. are taking a position that existing technologies should not be considered, including ones they've already developed, and that other countries, including, for example, China, are open to a consideration of all existing technologies as well? And if so, what would you say about this debate?
Yes, and I can't authoritatively say this specific country this is their official position, but exactly the difference that you've pointed out is the difference that some states say we shouldn't even think about banning at all. Some states say maybe we can consider a ban, but a ban may have two kinds of applications. One may be to existing equipment as well, and another approach is to say that it's for all equipment, for all weapons. But this is indeed so as you may know, the conventional weapons meeting this month in November in Geneva about how to take this issue further. And so I think one of the possibilities is that they will approach a group of governmental experts to take this issue further, and then exactly look in the first place at whether they want to move towards a ban, and if so, does it only reach into the future, or does it also cover existing technology? And of course, the underlying problem is clear. States have invested a lot of money, and they feel to some extent that they've gained an advantage, and for them to surrender this advantage is more difficult, but perhaps it's more easy for them. That will at least be something if they say for the future. Whether that's significant is a different, or whether that's sufficient, that's another question.
Thank you, Mr. Heyns, for coming, and thank you all for coming for the briefing.
Thank you, and we can continue that, that discussion.